The room went silent the moment he told her she didn't belong there. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried a weight that made every officer in the briefing room stop moving at the same time, as if the air itself had decided to hold its breath. Police Chief Robert Callahan stood at the head of the long conference table inside the Detroit Police Department's Internal Operations Wing, his presence firm, controlled, and accustomed to obedience. Across from him stood Grace Mitchell, a black woman in her early 30s, dressed in a plain charcoal blazer, holding a thin case file that looked ordinary to everyone except her. Callahan didn't even look at the document in her hands when he spoke again, his tone sharp but measured, the kind of voice that expected silence rather than response. "You're in the wrong room," he said, sliding a glance over her as if she were a misplaced administrative clerk who had wandered too far from her desk. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging brief looks but saying nothing. Grace didn't react the way he expected. She didn't step back, she didn't lower her gaze, and she didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she placed the file gently on the table, as if it carried more authority than the badge on his chest, and met his eyes with a calm that felt out of place in a room built on hierarchy. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold glow across the polished surface of the table, reflecting fragments of uniforms, badges, and unread tension. Callahan leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering just enough to make it more personal. "This is a command briefing. Not a place for misunderstandings." The pause before the last word lingered longer than it should have, and a couple of officers glanced down at their notes, pretending not to hear. Grace finally spoke, her voice even, steady, almost quiet, but carrying cleanly across the room. "I understand exactly where I am." That simple sentence did not raise her voice, but it changed the atmosphere in a way no one could ignore. Callahan's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the irritation of someone used to being unquestioned. He gestured toward the door. "Without looking at it. Then you understand this meeting doesn't include you." For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of radios crackling outside the room. Grace glanced briefly at the case file again, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her composure steady in a way that didn't seek approval or permission. The officers around the table remained still, unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake or something they hadn't yet been informed how to interpret. Callahan straightened his posture, reclaiming the center of the room with practiced authority, believing the situation had already been settled. But Grace Mitchell didn't move. The silence in the room did not break immediately, it stretched, uncomfortable and deliberate, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to correct what had just been said. Grace Mitchell remained exactly where she was standing, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the conference table, not as a gesture of defiance, but as if she had always belonged there and no one else had been informed yet. Around her, the Detroit Police Department briefing room carried the weight of authority, glass walls reflecting the city skyline, monitors glowing with case summaries, and officers seated in disciplined rows that now felt uncertain. Police Chief Robert Callahan adjusted his stance, interpreting her stillness as hesitation, mistaking calm for submission. He spoke again, this time louder, enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "I do not know who allowed you access to this floor, but this meeting is restricted to command personnel only." A few officers nodded subtly, reinforcing the hierarchy without words, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Grace finally turned slightly toward him, not rushed, not reactive, just precise in movement, as if every motion had been measured long before she entered the room. "I was assigned to this briefing 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice steady and without emphasis, carrying an authority that did not need volume. Callahan let out a short, dismissive breath, glancing at the file she had placed on the table earlier but not touching it. "Assigned by whom?" he asked, the question carrying the assumption that the answer would not matter. One of the officers near the far end of the table shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the direction of the exchange, while another glanced at the sealed envelope sitting beside Grace's file, noticing for the first time that it bore a federal compliance insignia. Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, She opened the file with a calm efficiency that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, revealing documents stamped with audit codes, departmental references, and oversight notices that none of the officers were expecting to see in a routine briefing. The atmosphere changed subtly, not through noise, but through recognition. Callahan noticed it too, though he refused to acknowledge it outwardly. Internal paperwork does not give you authority to interrupt operational command discussions, he said, though his tone had shifted slightly, less certainty, more defense. Grace closed the file again, gently, as if concluding a point that did not require debate. This is not internal paperwork, she replied, still calm, still measured. A quiet murmur passed through the room, quickly suppressed. Callahan straightened, reclaiming control through posture rather than argument. Then clarify your position, he said, his voice controlled but less firm than before. Grace looked at him directly now, and for the first time, the room seemed to register that she had not been uncertain at any point since she entered. I am here under authority of the oversight division responsible for this department, she said. The words landed without aggression, but with weight, like a document being placed on a desk that cannot be ignored. The officers exchanged sharper glances now, the earlier assumption of misunderstanding beginning to dissolve. Callahan held her gaze for a moment longer than before, then looked away briefly, as if recalibrating the situation internally. The room no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him, though nothing had been officially taken away. Grace remained still, not asserting dominance, not challenging authority, but simply existing in a position that made denial increasingly difficult. The shift in the room was not immediate, but it was undeniable. It began in small details that most people would have ignored if they were not already paying attention. An officer near the far end of the table quietly straightened the papers in front of him. Another adjusted the position of his chair, no longer leaning back with casual confidence. Even the faint background noise of shifting radios and distant hallway movement seemed to fade into something more controlled, more restrained. Grace Mitchell remained in the same position, but now the space around her felt different, as if the room had subtly reorganized itself around her presence without anyone openly acknowledging it. Police Chief Robert Callahan noticed it too, though he refused to let it appear on his face. He had spent years in rooms like this, where authority was expected to hold its shape under pressure, and yet something about this moment felt unfamiliar. Not threatening, not loud, but precise in a way that did not leave room for easy dismissal. He stepped closer to the table, placing one hand near the edge as if anchoring himself back into control. Oversight authority or not, he said slowly, carefully choosing each word, this department operates under established command structure, and interruptions during active briefings are not acceptable. His voice was steady again, but the earlier certainty had shifted into something more defensive, like a wall being rebuilt after a crack had already formed. Grace did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at the file she had already opened, turning one page with a controlled motion, as if reviewing something that had been verified long before this conversation began. When she spoke, her tone remained unchanged, calm and grounded. The purpose of this briefing is to review internal conduct patterns across active operations, she said. That includes command-level decisions. A faint reaction moved through the room, subtle but visible, as a few officers exchanged brief glances. The words were not aggressive, but they redefined the structure of the conversation in a way that could not be ignored. Callahan's jaw tightened slightly. He looked toward his deputy, then back at Grace. We have internal review processes for that, he said. They do not require external presence during command sessions. Grace closed the file again, gently, aligning the edges with deliberate precision. This is not external, she replied. The sentence landed quietly, but with enough weight to shift attention across the table. One of the officers near the center hesitated, then reached slowly toward a sealed document envelope that had been placed at his station earlier that morning. It carried a mark that most of the room had not yet recognized, but now several eyes were drawn to it. Callahan noticed the movement and frowned slightly. What is that? He asked. The officer paused before answering, as if reconsidering how to phrase it. "It arrived with the briefing materials," he said. It was flagged as priority oversight documentation. The room grew quieter again, not from command, but from awareness beginning to settle unevenly across different minds at the same time. Grace remained still, her attention now directed toward Callahan without pressure or escalation, simply present. "You were notified in advance," she said. This meeting was never exclusive to operational command. For the first time, Callahan did not respond immediately. His eyes moved briefly to the sealed envelope, then back to her, then to the officers around the table, as if recalculating the structure of the room itself. The authority he had assumed was absolute no longer felt as isolated as it had minutes before. Nothing had been taken from him, yet something had clearly been introduced that changed how everything else would now be interpreted. The room did not return to normal after the brief moment of uncertainty. Instead, it seemed to settle into a new and unfamiliar version of quiet, one that carried awareness rather than ignorance. Every officer present in the Detroit Police Department briefing room now sat with a different posture, not out of command, but out of consideration. Even the faint movement of papers, the soft clicks of pens, and the subtle shifts in chairs felt more deliberate than before. Grace Mitchell remained unchanged in demeanor, standing beside the long conference table as if the environment had never dictated her position in the first place. Police Chief Robert Callahan watched her closely now, not with anger, but with recalculation. The certainty he had carried into the room had not disappeared, but it had begun to compete with something he was not accustomed to entertaining in public settings, uncertainty without clear origin. He stepped slightly away from the table, creating distance rather than dominance, as if space itself might restore clarity. "If this is an oversight matter," he said carefully, his voice lower than before, "then proper procedure requires formal notification before integration into command-level discussion." Grace did not move at his statement. Instead, she reached into her folder and retrieved a single document, placing it on the table with quiet precision. It was not dramatic, not forceful, but it demanded attention in the same way official seals always do. The officers closest to it leaned forward slightly without realizing they had done so. Callahan's eyes followed the paper as it came to rest. The header was clear enough to change tone without explanation. Internal Affairs Compliance Division, Federal Oversight Authorization. A silence followed that was different from the earlier silence. It was not confusion anymore, but recognition forming in stages. One of the senior officers at the table cleared his throat softly, as if trying to understand whether speaking would improve or disrupt what was unfolding. Callahan did not touch the document. Instead, he looked back at Grace, his expression controlled but no longer fully anchored in assumption. "Federal oversight is not typically embedded directly in active command briefings," he said. Grace nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. "Not typically," she replied. "But this department is currently under extended review due to multiple flagged operational inconsistencies across internal reporting channels." The phrase was not accusatory in tone, but it carried structure, and structure in that room mattered more than emotion. Callahan's deputy shifted slightly in his seat, glancing between the document and the chief, as if trying to locate where authority now logically resided. Grace continued, her voice steady and controlled. "My role is not to participate in command decisions," she said. "It is to observe, document, and verify alignment between operational conduct and established federal compliance standards." The explanation did not escalate tension, but it clarified boundaries that were no longer informal. The room absorbed the meaning slowly. Callahan finally extended his hand toward the document, pausing for a fraction of a second before lifting it. He scanned the first page, his expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of context that could not be dismissed without consequence. The officers around the table remained silent, watching the shift without intervening. When he set the document back down, his movements were slower than before. The authority he had projected at the beginning of the meeting had not been removed, but it had been reframed within a larger structure that now included him rather than excluded him. Grace stood exactly as she had since entering, neither advancing nor retreating, her presence defined not by reaction but by consistency. Callahan looked at her again, and this time the glance was no longer about control. It was about understanding what had already been decided before he spoke his first sentence. The atmosphere in the briefing room had shifted again, but this time the change was less about surprise and more about acceptance forming under pressure. The federal oversight document remained on the table, its presence no longer questioned, only studied in silence by those who understood what it represented. Grace Mitchell stayed composed beside it, her posture unchanged, her attention steady and directed forward without urgency. Police Chief Robert Callahan stood a few feet away now, no longer anchoring himself at the head of the table. The symbolic distance between him and the center of command felt subtly altered, though no one had formally acknowledged any change in structure. He glanced toward his deputy. Then toward the senior officers seated along the table, reading their silence as careful restraint rather than confusion. For the first time since Grace had entered the room, Callahan did not immediately speak. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if recalibrating the environment in real time. When he finally addressed her again, his tone had softened, not in submission, but in procedural caution. If this level of oversight is active, he said carefully, then there should have been prior coordination with command leadership before any engagement in operational review sessions. Grace responded without hesitation, her voice still calm and precise. Notification was issued through official channels prior to this briefing cycle, she said. Confirmation of receipt was logged within departmental compliance systems. One of the officers near the center of the table shifted forward slightly, glancing at a tablet device in front of him. After a brief moment, he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if verifying what she had stated. The realization spread quietly, not as shock, but as confirmation of something that had already been recorded but not fully processed by those present. Callahan noticed the movement and turned his attention briefly toward the officer, then back to Grace. The structure of authority he had relied on was still intact in form, but its exclusivity had clearly been modified without his direct participation. Then why was this not escalated through my office directly, he asked, maintaining control over his tone. Grace adjusted her gaze slightly, not defensive, not reactive, but factual. It was, she said. Through administrative compliance routing. The escalation path bypasses direct operational command when internal risk thresholds are met. The phrase hung in the room with procedural clarity. It was not an opinion or interpretation, but a system description that reframed what had occurred before anyone in the room had chosen to engage with it. The deputy shifted again, this time exchanging a quiet look with another senior officer, both of them now clearly aware that this meeting was no longer purely internal in scope. Callahan placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, not in confrontation, but in focus. And those thresholds were determined by your division alone, he said. Grace shook her head once, subtle but definitive. They were determined by accumulated reporting data across multiple review cycles, she replied. This department is one of several under parallel evaluation. The weight of that statement settled differently across the room. It extended the context beyond the walls of the briefing room, beyond even the department itself. Callahan straightened again, his expression controlled, but his authority now existing alongside something he could not fully direct. He looked at Grace for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less assumption and more inquiry. What exactly is the scope of your review here? He asked. Grace paused only briefly, not for uncertainty, but for precision. To verify operational integrity, procedural compliance, and alignment with federal oversight standards, she said. And to ensure that command authority is being exercised within those boundaries. The final words reframed the entire room without raising volume or tension. Nothing had been taken away from Callahan in that instant, but something fundamental had been defined above him that had not been visible before. Grace remained still, her role now understood by several in the room not as participation, but as structure itself, existing around and above the process they had been operating within. The silence inside the briefing room had changed its texture again, becoming less like tension and more like sustained attention. Every person present now understood that what was unfolding was not a disruption of normal procedure, but the exposure of a larger structure that had already been in motion before the meeting began. Grace Mitchell stood near the table, still and composed, her presence no longer interpreted through uncertainty but through recognition of defined authority. The federal oversight documentation remained visible, resting at the center of the table like a fixed reference point that no longer required explanation. Police Chief Robert Callahan had stopped attempting to reassert dominance through position or tone. Instead, he remained standing a short distance away, his posture controlled, his attention divided between the document and Grace herself, as if recalculating the boundaries of the room in real time. The officers seated along both sides of the table no longer exchanged casual glances. Their focus had narrowed into quiet observation, each of them processing the same realization from slightly different angles, none of them willing to interrupt the unfolding clarity with unnecessary speech. Grace finally moved for the first time in several minutes, not toward Callahan or the center of the table, but toward the far end where a mounted display screen showed active departmental case summaries. She stopped in front of it, scanning the visible data with calm precision. Her voice, when she spoke, remained steady and evenly measured. "These active case logs reflect the current operational priorities of this department," she said. "However, several entries are missing required compliance tagging under federal reporting guidelines." The statement was not framed as accusation, but as observation, yet its implications were immediate. A senior officer near the display shifted forward, leaning in to review the same entries she was referencing. After a few seconds, he confirmed quietly that certain classifications were indeed incomplete. Callahan turned his head slightly toward the screen, his expression tightening, not in frustration, but in focused assessment. "Those entries are part of ongoing field adjustments," he said. Grace turned her attention back to him without delay. "Ongoing adjustments are permitted," she replied, "but only when properly documented within active compliance tracking systems. Without that documentation, operational integrity cannot be verified." The room remained silent, but the silence now carried structure rather than uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that forms when multiple people arrive at the same conclusion independently but are still waiting for permission to acknowledge it. Callahan walked slowly back toward the table, stopping at the edge rather than reclaiming the head position. For the first time since the meeting began, his physical placement no longer defined the room. "You are saying there are systemic gaps," he said carefully. Grace did not elevate her tone. "I am saying there are discrepancies between recorded procedures and operational execution," she replied. The distinction was subtle, but everyone in the room understood it clearly. One referred to interpretation, the other to verification. A junior officer near the far end of the table glanced down at his notes, then quietly closed the folder in front of him as if realizing it no longer represented the full scope of what was being discussed. Callahan looked at Grace for a longer moment than before, his expression no longer defensive, but engaged in active evaluation. "And your role is to confirm those discrepancies," he said. Grace nodded once. "And to ensure corrective alignment where necessary," she said. The phrase carried no emotional weight, but its implication extended beyond the room. It defined a responsibility that did not depend on permission from those being reviewed. Callahan exhaled slowly, looking briefly around the room, then back at the federal documentation still resting on the table. The structure of authority he had relied upon had not been removed, but it had been placed within a larger framework that now included external verification at its core. He returned his attention to Grace, and for the first time since her arrival, his voice carried less resistance and more procedural acknowledgment. "Then we proceed under full disclosure," he said. Grace responded simply. "That is already in effect." The room did not react outwardly, but something had clearly settled into place. Not resolution, not conflict, but defined understanding of how the situation had been structured from the beginning. The room had entered a new phase of stillness, one that no longer felt like hesitation but like structured acceptance. Every person inside the Detroit Police Department briefing room now understood that the situation was no longer unfolding within a familiar internal hierarchy, but within a layered system that extended beyond it. Grace Mitchell remained positioned near the center table, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, her presence no longer questioned in silence but acknowledged in calculation. The federal oversight documentation remained in place, untouched, yet it had become the reference point against which every action in the room was now measured. Police Chief Robert Callahan stood slightly apart from the table, no longer attempting to reclaim a central position that no longer felt absolute. His expression was controlled, but his attention was fully engaged, moving between Grace, the officers, and the documents as if reconstructing the framework of authority in real time. The senior officers seated along the table had also shifted in demeanor. They were no longer observing Grace as an external presence, but as a defined component of the system they operated within, even if that realization had only just reached them. Grace finally turned away from the display screen and returned her focus to the table. Her movements were measured and deliberate, carrying no urgency and no hesitation. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, even, and precisely controlled. "At this stage," she said, "the next step is to begin structured verification of operational logs against reported incident outcomes." A subtle shift moved through the room. The phrase was procedural, but its implication extended beyond routine review. It signaled that what had been discussed was now transitioning into active assessment. Callahan looked at her for a moment, then spoke with careful restraint. "And what exactly does structured verification involve under your authority?" he asked. Grace did not immediately respond. Instead, she reached into her folder and retrieved a secondary set of documents, placing them beside the first with the same quiet precision as before. The officers closest to her leaned slightly forward again, recognizing that each layer of documentation represented a deeper level of review. "It involves cross-referencing operational reports with independent compliance tracking systems," she said. "Any discrepancies identified will require formal adjustment protocols before continuation of active case processing." The room absorbed the statement in silence. It was not dramatic, but it was definitive. One of the senior officers near the center slowly exhaled, glancing down at his own case summary sheets as if seeing them in a different context for the first time. Callahan's eyes moved briefly across the table, then back to Grace. His tone remained controlled, but it had shifted from resistance to engagement. "So the department continues operations while under continuous review," he said. Grace nodded once. "Correct," she replied. "Operational continuity is maintained. Compliance validation occurs in parallel." The distinction mattered. It meant nothing had been stopped, but everything was now being observed, measured, and verified simultaneously. Callahan placed both hands on the table, not as a gesture of control, but as a point of stability. For the first time since the beginning of the meeting, he no longer attempted to redefine Grace's position. Instead, he acknowledged the structure that had already been established. "Then all command decisions moving forward are subject to that verification process," he said. Grace met his gaze directly. "Yes," she said simply. The room did not react outwardly, but internally the understanding had fully settled. The authority Callahan held remained intact in function, but it now existed within a defined boundary that extended beyond the room itself. Grace did not assert dominance, nor did she seek validation. She simply remained, as the system around her continued to reveal itself layer by layer, until what once appeared as a standard command briefing had become something far more structured, and far less optional than anyone had initially assumed. The briefing room had reached a point of equilibrium that felt neither temporary nor fragile, but structurally redefined. The presence of federal oversight was no longer treated as an interruption to normal operations, but as an integrated layer within them, shaping how every statement, document, and decision would now be interpreted moving forward. Grace Mitchell remained in place beside the central table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and steady, as if nothing in the room had ever required her to adjust her position in response to authority. The documents before her were now partially organized into 2 stacks, each aligned with quiet precision, reflecting a methodical process that had already moved beyond explanation and into execution. Police Chief Robert Callahan stood across from her, no longer attempting to reclaim dominance through presence or tone. Instead, his focus had shifted into something more restrained, more internal, as if he were reconciling the boundaries of authority he had always assumed were fixed with the reality now clearly defined in front of him. The officers seated along the table remained silent, their attention no longer divided or uncertain, but fully directed toward understanding the implications of what had already been acknowledged. Grace finally closed the top folder in front of her, the sound soft but final in the otherwise quiet room. When she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision that had defined her from the beginning. At this stage, she said, the review process will transition into corrective coordination across all flagged operational categories. The words were not framed as instruction, but as procedural fact. Callahan nodded slowly, acknowledging the structure rather than resisting it. And corrective coordination will be executed in collaboration with command leadership, he said, carefully aligning his response within the framework she had established. Grace looked at him directly, her expression unchanged. Correct, she replied. A long pause followed, but it was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with recognition. The senior officers exchanged brief glances, not out of confusion, but out of realization that their roles had already been repositioned within a system that extended beyond this room. One of them quietly closed his notebook, as if concluding that independent speculation was no longer necessary. Callahan stepped slightly back from the table, not in withdrawal, but in acknowledgment of procedural transition. His voice, when it came again, was measured and controlled. Then moving forward, he said, all operational directives related to these categories will be reviewed prior to execution. Grace nodded once. All directives within flagged categories require verification clearance, she confirmed. The exchange was not confrontational, nor was it adversarial. It was structural alignment taking place in real time, without disruption. The officers present now understood that nothing they had been doing was being erased or invalidated, but rather placed within a broader system of oversight that had already been active before this meeting began. Grace gathered her documents into a single, aligned stack, then closed the folder completely. She did not look around the room for validation, nor did she wait for acknowledgement. Her role, as it had been defined throughout the session, existed independently of reaction. Callahan observed her for a moment longer, then gave a slight, deliberate nod, not as submission, but as procedural acceptance of the framework now governing the room. The tension that had once defined the space was no longer present. In its place remained structure, clarity, and an understanding that authority had not been removed, but expanded into a system none of them could operate outside of anymore. The room had settled into a silence that no longer felt temporary or uncertain, but complete, as if every person inside the Detroit Police Department briefing space had reached the same understanding without needing further confirmation. Grace Mitchell stood at the edge of the central table, her documents fully organized and closed, her presence now interpreted not as an interruption of authority, but as the framework within which authority had been operating all along. Police Chief Robert Callahan remained across from her, no longer attempting to assert control or redefine hierarchy, but instead standing in a measured stillness that reflected acceptance of procedural reality. The officers seated along the table no longer shifted or exchanged glances. Their attention had stabilized into quiet focus, each of them aware that nothing further in this room would be decided through reaction, only through structure already established beyond it. Grace finally took a step back from the table, not as withdrawal, but as completion of her function within the space. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and deliberate, carrying no trace of tension or triumph, only consistency. She looked briefly toward Callahan, not waiting for acknowledgement, but confirming procedural closure. All review segments for this briefing cycle have been documented, she said, her voice even and precise. Next phase coordination will continue through formal compliance channels. Callahan nodded once, slowly, not as concession, but as recognition that the process had moved beyond discussion. Understood, he replied, his tone controlled and steady, no longer resisting the structure that had been defined. A faint shift moved through the room as several officers began quietly organizing their materials, not out of dismissal, but out of completion awareness. One by one, folders were closed, devices were powered down, and notes were aligned, each action reflecting an unspoken acknowledgement that the meeting had reached its natural endpoint. Grace gathered her final document, placed it securely inside her case, and closed it with a soft click that carried more finality than any spoken instruction in the room. She turned toward the exit without pause, her movement unhurried, neither emphasized nor minimized, simply consistent with everything she had done since entering. As she walked toward the door, no one stopped her, not because they could not, but because there was no procedural basis remaining to do so. Callahan watched her for a moment, his expression composed, then shifted his attention back to the table, where the remaining officers now sat in structured silence that mirrored the conclusion of something larger than a single briefing. The federal documentation remained on the table, but it no longer functioned as an object of uncertainty. It had become reference, boundary, and confirmation of system alignment. Grace reached the doorway and paused only briefly, not to reconsider, but to allow the space behind her to settle into its new state of understanding. Then she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her without force or emphasis. Inside the room, no one spoke immediately. The absence of dialogue was not confusion, but processing, as each individual recalibrated their understanding of authority, oversight, and operational structure. Callahan finally turned slightly toward his deputy, giving a small nod that signaled continuation under revised conditions. The briefing room lights remained steady, the city outside unchanged, but within the department, the framework that governed decision-making had been permanently redefined, not through confrontation, but through quiet confirmation of where authority had always ultimately resided.